What's gaming, gamers? Today I've got a video for you using the newest Titan exotic armor piece, Melas Panoplia. This build is incredibly fun. You'll be clearing ads like they're not even there. Survivability is also no problem, as you'll have a constant source of restoration ×1 and the cure ×1 buff, ensuring you almost never die no matter what difficulty you're playing on. But before we get into the video itself, I've got a few things to say. Skip to the timestamp on screen if you just care about the build itself. If you're looking for people to play any content in Destiny with, ranging from portal activities and pinnacle farming all the way to raids, dungeons, and mythic difficulty content, feel free to join the Discord server. We welcome anyone, no matter how new or seasoned you are, and all of us will teach encounters if you don't know something. If you're interested, hop into the Discord server and play some Destiny with us. The link is in the description. Furthermore, if you have any build ideas you'd like to see me cover, or simply have ideas for different guide-style videos you'd like to see me make, let me know in the comments. I'm looking to expand my videos from simply build guides, and I'm open to ideas. I'm also looking to stream on Twitch more often, and I won't just be playing Destiny over there. On top of Destiny, I'll be playing more story-driven games and going for achievements in those games, as I find achievement hunting to be very fun. If that's interesting to you, my Twitch link is in the description. Now for the build itself, I'll start with a prescriptive build guide in case that's what you're looking for. Once I've done that, I'll go into detail about what each element of the build does, why I've chosen them, as well as any alternative options and their pros and cons should there be any. As always, there are video chapters along the timeline as well as timestamps in the description for you to skip to any specific section you'd like more detail on. For the prescriptive build guide, firstly, use the Melas Panoplia exotic arms armor. For your solar subclass, use the Hammer of Soul Super, the Towering Barricade, whichever jump you prefer, the Throwing Hammer Melee, the Healing Grenade, the Roaring Flames aspect, the Soul Invictus aspect, Ember of Mercy, Ember of Searing, Ember of Solace, and Ember of Torches. For the Season Reclamation artifact, use the Reciprocal Draw mod, the Refresh Threads mod, the Elemental Coalescence mod, the Shield Crush mod, and the Elemental Overdrive mod. For armor stat distribution, I have 90 health, 180 melee, 32 grenade, 32 super, 35 class, and 66 weapons. For armor archetypes, I have 4 brawler pieces and 1 gunner piece. For armor set bonuses, I recommend either the 2-piece Bushido set or the 4-piece Collective Psyche set. For the armor's mod setup, on your helmet, run 1 hands-on mod, 1 harmonic siphon mod, and 1 heavy ammo finder mod. On your arms, run 1 heavy-handed mod, and 1 melee font mod. On your chest piece, run 1 arc, 1 solar, and 1 void resistance mod. On your legs, run 1 recuperation mod, and 2 solar weapon surge mods. On your mark, run 1 bomber mod, and 2 time dilation mods. For weapons, in the kinetic slot, use the Wastelander M5 kinetic shotgun from Dares of Eternity with the perk combination of slide shot and 1-2 punch. In the energy slot, use the Devil's Ruin exotic solar sidearm. In the heavy slot, use the Outrageous Fortune solar grenade launcher from Pinnacle Ops with the perk combination of Envious Assassin and Bait and Switch. Now to get into the descriptive part of the build, I'll start with the Melas Panoplia exotic arms armor. Melas Panoplia has the exotic perk Forge Master, which will grant you the Forge Master buff upon collecting a fire sprite or getting rapid solar weapon kills. The Forge Master buff will stay active until you throw your throwing hammer. Once you've thrown it, the buff will have a 12-second duration. While Forge Master is active, impacting an enemy with your throwing hammer will allow you to recall the throwing hammer to your position, and your throwing hammer will be granted a slight tracking capability. Around 2 seconds after you've impacted an enemy with your Forge Master hammer, you can recall the hammer to perform a perfect recall. Perfect recalls will cause your hammer to explode at its current position, dealing damage to enemies within 5 meters of its location. Performing perfect recalls and collecting further fire sprites will extend the Forge Master buff duration by 3 seconds. Melas Panoplia is an incredibly fun exotic and will give your throwing hammers the ability to not only deal significant single target damage, but also to kill large groups of enemies by performing a perfect recall. Melas Panoplia almost makes Solar Titan feel as though you're playing a rhythm game, using your hammer, waiting for the visual and or sound cue to perform a perfect recall, performing it, and then doing it all over again makes the build feel like it really flows with itself. It's incredibly satisfying to use. Now that you know what Melas Panoplia does, I'll get into the subclasses set up for this build, starting with the Hammer of Soul Super. Hammer of Soul will allow you to summon a flaming hammer, which grants you a 90% resistance to all incoming damage while active. The super lasts for 21 seconds by default, and throwing a hammer reduces your super's duration by 2.5 seconds. Once your hammers impact an enemy, the hammer will explode, dealing damage and releasing 4 pieces of solar shrapnel, each one dealing damage to enemies hit. If your hammers are in the air for 0.7 seconds before they impact an enemy, they'll release 5 pieces of shrapnel instead of 4. Hammer of Soul is a really fun super, but it's not really the strongest super on its own, especially given this build doesn't spec into the super stat really at all. The Roaring Flames aspect really helps its damage, but I'll go over that interaction when I get to the aspects. For the purposes of this build, Hammer of Soul is better than the Burning Maul super, but you can try Burning Maul to see if it's more fun for you. Onto the class ability, the Towering Barricade will create a tall barrier in front of you for 20 seconds that absorbs all incoming damage. The barrier itself does have a health pool, but it takes 90% reduced damage from any non-boss enemy, allowing it to protect you for its entire 20-second duration nearly every time you cast it. Furthermore, while standing behind your Towering Barricade, you'll have a 60% resistance to all incoming splash damage, helping you to survive against enemy grenades or explosive projectiles that impact around you. The Towering Barricade is chosen for this build mostly to be used as a piece of cover if you need it. With this build, you'll never really be standing still in one spot long enough to need either the Towering or Rally Barricades. However, if you have to capture a plate for an activity or something similar, the Towering Barricade can cut off an angle that you'd otherwise be exposed to, helping your survivability. Furthermore, Towering Barricade will also grant you more grenade energy via the Bomber mod on your mark when you cast it, which is another slight benefit to the Towering Barricade over the Rally. For the melee ability, the Throwing Hammer will allow you to throw a hammer from a distance, dealing damage to any enemy it hits. The hammer can be collected off the ground after having been thrown, and collecting it after it's impacted an enemy will grant you the Cure ×1 buff, healing you for 60 health. Leaving the hammer on the ground for 10 seconds will cause it to explode, dealing damage to nearby enemies and preventing you from collecting the hammer. Throwing Hammer is the only melee ability that works with Melas Panoplia, making it the only choice. It's a decent melee ability on its own, but it's enhanced significantly by Melas Panoplia. For the grenade, the Healing Grenade will apply the Cure ×1 buff to any ally within 7.5 meters of its impact location, instantly healing them for 60 health. Furthermore, at the location of the Healing Grenade's impact, a Restoration Orb will be summoned that lasts 7.5 seconds before disappearing. Upon collecting the Restoration Orb, any ally that collects it will be granted the Restoration ×1 buff for 4 seconds. The Healing Grenade is chosen simply to act as a safety net in case you ever find yourself low on health without the Forge Master buff procced or any other way to heal yourself. As this build doesn't spec into the grenade stat at all, you won't have the Healing Grenade charged all too often in order to make use of it, but it's still a fantastic piece of life-saving utility should you end up needing it. Onto the aspects. Firstly, Roaring Flames will cause any solar ability or ignition kill to grant you a stack of the Roaring Flames buff for 20 seconds. Roaring Flames can stack up to 3 times, and any subsequent solar ability or ignition kill while at 3 stacks will refresh its duration up to its maximum of 20 seconds. Furthermore, while Roaring Flames is active, your unpowered melee attacks will count as powered melee attacks and will inflict 30 Scorch on any enemy hit by your unpowered melee. At 1 stack of Roaring Flames, your powered melee will deal 66% more damage, and your grenade and your super will deal 20% more damage. At 2 stacks of Roaring Flames, your powered melee will deal 133% more damage, and your grenade and your super will deal 44% more damage. Lastly, at 3 stacks of Roaring Flames, your powered melee will deal 200% more damage, and your grenade and your super will deal 73% more damage. Roaring Flames is perfect for this build as it'll allow your Throwing Hammer to deal triple its base damage at 3 stacks. This will help you significantly in all difficulties, as it'll allow you to deal with almost all enemies with the Throwing Hammer alone, which can be very helpful if you don't have any special or heavy ammo, or if you simply want to save your ammo. The second aspect, Soul Invictus, will allow you to summon sunspots with every solar ability kill, scorched enemy kill, and Hammer of Soul impact. Standing in a sunspot will grant you the Soul Invictus buff for 5 seconds, and will similarly apply the Restoration ×1 buff to you for 5 seconds. Furthermore, while standing in a sunspot, your abilities will recharge significantly faster, and your super will passively drain 40% slower. Lastly, sunspots deal damage to enemies and will apply 5 Scorch Tacks every time they tick damage onto an enemy. Soul Invictus is chosen simply for its Restoration ×1 effect. You'll be generating sunspots nearly every time you kill an enemy, effectively granting you restoration for the entirety of an encounter. Furthermore, your Throwing Hammer will cure you whenever you collect it off the ground or when you recall it using Melas Panoplia, so long as you hit an enemy with it. This means that getting a kill with your Throwing Hammer will not only instantly heal you for 60 health, but will also allow you to run into the sunspot to grant yourself restoration, significantly increasing your survivability. Onto the fragments. Firstly, Ember of Mercy will grant you and any allies nearby you the restoration ×1 buff for 5 seconds upon reviving an ally. Furthermore, Ember of Mercy will grant you restoration ×1 for 2 seconds upon the collection of any fire sprite, with fire sprites similarly increasing any restoration buff you already have active by 2 seconds. Lastly, Ember of Mercy comes with a 10-point boost to your health stat. Ember of Mercy is chosen for its restoration properties and really nothing more. You'll need to collect fire sprites to get the most out of your Devil's Ruin sidearm, and fire sprites also make the Forge Master buff easier to acquire as well as increasing its duration, so making their collection safer is a fantastic boon to your survivability. The second fragment, Ember of Searing, will grant you melee energy every time you defeat a scorched target and will cause a fire sprite to be summoned upon defeating any scorched enemy. The melee energy gained from Ember of Searing differs based on the tier of enemy killed, with higher tier enemies granting more melee energy per kill. Ember of Searing also comes with a 10-point boost to your class stat. Ember of Searing is brought mostly to increase your fire sprite generation, and especially so if you don't use the Devil's Ruin exotic sidearm. Ember of Searing's melee energy gains are pretty much inconsequential, as you should never be without your throwing hammer, but generating more fire sprites is always beneficial with this build. Third for fragments is Ember of Solace. Ember of Solace will simply increase the duration of every radiant and restoration effect applied to you by 50%. Ember of Solace is fantastic for this build, as it'll effectively single-handedly ensure you never lose either your radiant or your restoration buffs. Ember of Solace is less effective for your radiant buff, as the next fragment Ember of Torches will have you covered there, but for restoration, Ember of Solace is hugely beneficial, especially on higher difficulties where it can be harder to get kills to keep your buffs active. Lastly, for fragments, Ember of Torches will grant you and any allies within 8 meters of you the Radiant buff for 8 seconds instantly upon dealing any powered melee damage. If you or your allies have the Ember of Solace fragment equipped, Radiant will be granted for 12 seconds instead. Lastly, Ember of Torches comes with a 10-point deficit to your grenade stat. Ember of Torches is simply brought to ensure your weapons are dealing 20% increased damage at all times thanks to the Radiant buff. This ensures you're always dealing maximum damage to enemies whenever you need to shoot them, as well as allowing you the option to use your special and heavy ammo on mini-bosses and bosses without losing out on a ton of damage by not having Radiant active. With the entire subclass setup now detailed, I'll get into the artifact mods to run if you're watching this video during the season Reclamation. The first artifact mod to run is Reciprocal Draw. Reciprocal Draw will cause 3 rapid non-sidearm weapon kills to grant your equipped sidearms a damage boost that lasts 6 seconds once you've drawn them. Primary ammo sidearms are granted a 35% boost to their damage, and special ammo sidearms are granted a 15% boost to their damage. Reciprocal Draw is simply brought as a passive, although infrequent, damage boost for your Devil's Ruin sidearm. You generally won't be getting non-sidearm weapon kills, and you'll be getting those kills rapidly, even less frequently. But there's no point in not running Reciprocal Draw for the 35% Devil's Ruin damage boost every once in a while. Second, for artifact mods, Refreshed Threads will grant you ability energy for your least charged ability upon collecting an elemental pickup that matches your super's damage type. Refreshed Threads is brought merely to be a passive increase to either your Towering Barricade or your Healing Grenade's uptime. You'll be generating and collecting many fire sprites, so Refreshed Threads is a great passive mod to increase the uptime on those abilities. The third artifact mod, Elemental Coalescence, will allow you to summon a super element matching elemental pickup after getting between 4 and 9 kills. Any kills count for Elemental Coalescence. Ability and weapon kills both count, and neither your ability nor your weapon kills have to match your super's element for Elemental Coalescence to summon an elemental pickup. Elemental Coalescence is chosen to even further increase your fire sprite uptime. Yes, fire sprites do have a 5-second cooldown between creations, but with the amount of ways this build can actively generate them, with Devil's Ruin, Ember of Searing, and now Elemental Coalescence, you'll almost always be generating a fire sprite the second they're off cooldown. Fourth for artifact mods is Shield Crush. Shield Crush will grant you an increase to your melee's recharge rate and a 50% increase to your powered melee damage while you have either Woven Mail, Frost Armor, or a Void Overshield. Shield Crush will instead grant you an increase to your grenade's recharge rate as well as a 25% increase to your grenade's damage while you are either amplified or radiant. Shield Crush is selected as it'll passively increase your healing grenade's passive regeneration rate. With this build's uptime on the radiant buff, you'll have Shield Crush's increased grenade regeneration rate effectively all of the time, helping its uptime significantly. As this build doesn't spec into the grenade stat at all, using Shield Crush is hugely beneficial to your healing grenade's uptime, and by extension your overall Survivability. Fifth and finally for artifact mods, Elemental Overdrive will grant you a 10% damage boost to your weapons when you collect a pickup that corresponds with that weapon's damage type. Elemental Overdrive's damage boost stacks with any weapon surge mods you have and lasts for 7 seconds after collecting an elemental pickup. Elemental Overdrive will be hugely beneficial for your Devil's Ruin and your Outrageous Fortunes damage. As you'll be collecting fire sprites effectively once every 5 seconds, you'll have Elemental Overdrive's 10% damage boost to all solar weapons active nearly 100% of the time, which is a fantastic boost to your weapon's effectiveness. With this season's artifact mods now detailed, I'll get into the armor setup for this build, starting with stat distribution. The armor stat benefits almost all increase linearly, so in order to save time, I'll only be describing each benefit's maximum effectiveness at either the 100 or 200 point breakpoints. My armor with this build has 90 health, 180 melee, 32 grenade, 32 super, 35 class, and 66 weapons. Firstly, for stats, the health stat will grant you up to a maximum of 10% flinch resistance at 100 points, as well as causing the collection of orbs of power to grant you up to a maximum of 70 health per orb at 100 points. While above 100 points in the health stat, you'll be granted an increase to your overshield's overall health up to a maximum of 20 extra health at 200 points, an increase to your overshield's recharge rate up to a maximum of 45% at 200 points, and a decrease to the delay between taking damage and the start of your health regeneration up to a maximum of 25% at 200 points. Health is pretty much unimportant for this build, as you'll have incredibly consistent access to both the Cure ×1 buff and the Restoration ×1 buff. However, because of the Brawler armor archetype having melee as its primary stat and health as its secondary stat, you'll always end up with a high health stat while using this build. Definitely don't focus anything extra into health, however, as you'll be perfectly fine relying on Cure and Restoration for healing. The second stat, Melee, will lower the base cooldown of your melee by up to a maximum of 65% at 100 points, as well as increasing the amount of energy gained by any active source of melee generation. While above 100 points in the melee stat, you'll be granted up to a maximum of a 30% melee damage increase at 200 points. The melee stat's damage increase works for all powered melees, all unpowered melees, as well as glaive melee attacks. The melee stat's damage increase is also multiplicative. Melee is this build's most important stat to spec into, and you'll want to get it as close to 200 as you can in order to get the maximum damage increase for your throwing hammer. If you can't get it to 200, you can run melee font mods in your arms, which will increase your melee stat by 20, 40, and 50 points with 1, 2, or 3 mods equipped respectively, so long as you have stacks of armor charge. Third, for stats, Grenade will lower the base cooldown of your grenade ability by up to a maximum of 65% at 100 points, as well as increasing the amount of energy gained by any active source of grenade generation. While above 100 points in the grenade stat, you'll be granted up to a maximum of a 65% grenade damage increase at 200 points. Grenade is entirely unimportant for this build, and I don't recommend having any extra points spec'd into the grenade stat. This build only uses the healing grenade as a preventative measure or a panic button, and as such, you won't need to be using it all too often. Furthermore, collecting fire sprites will grant you grenade energy, and the Shield Crush artifact mod will decrease your grenade's passive cooldown, making the grenade stat even less important for this build. The fourth stat, Super, will increase the amount of active super energy granted by any source of active super energy gains up to 100 points. While above 100 points in Super, your Super's damage will be increased up to a maximum of 45% at 200 points, and the duration of the Well of Radiance and Ward of Dawn supers will be increased up to a maximum of 33% at 200 points. The super stat is also completely unnecessary to spec into with this build. Yes, it would be nice to have some points in it to increase its uptime, but other stats are more important. As that's the case, try not to use any armor with dedicated points in super. Fifth for stats is class. The class stat will increase your class ability's base regeneration rate per point up to 100 points, and will also increase the amount of active class ability energy you can generate per point up to 100 points. While above 100 points, the class stat will grant you an overshield for 5 seconds when using a Hunter Dodge or the Titan Thruster ability, or for 10 seconds while using a Warlock Rift or a Titan Barricade. The overshield has a maximum 40 health when at 200 points in the class stat. The class stat, similarly to the grenade stat, is completely insignificant. You won't be using your towering barricade nearly ever, as this build has a much more active playstyle that keeps you alive on its own. Try not to spec into the class stat at all, and instead focus on other, more important stats like melee and weapons. Sixth, and finally for stats, the weapons stat will grant all of your weapons an increase to their handling and reload speed stats, up to a maximum 0.9 times handling duration multiplier and a 0.9 times reload duration multiplier at 100 points. Furthermore, weapon damage dealt to rank and file and elite combatants is increased up to a maximum 15% at 100 points. While above 100 points in the weapon stat, any ammo bricks summoned are granted a chance to grant increased ammo when collected, up to a maximum 100% chance at 200 points. Additionally, primary and special ammo weapons are granted a damage increase against bosses up to a maximum of 15% at 200 points, and heavy ammo weapons are granted a slightly lesser damage boost up to a maximum of a 10% increase at 200 points. Weapons will be the most important tertiary stat for this build, as it'll simply help your weapons deal as much damage as they can. The weapons stat will ensure your Wastelander M5 can kill mages and elites with consistency, and it'll help your Devil's Ruin kill adds more quickly to generate fire sprites, which are both fantastic benefits for this build. As far as armor archetypes go, I'd recommend having 4 or 5 pieces of Brawler armor. Brawler armor has melee as its primary stat and health as its secondary stat. So when farming Brawler armor, try to focus weapons as the tertiary stat. My armor with this build only has 4 Brawler pieces however. My chest piece is a gunner piece, which itself has weapons as its primary stat and grenade as its secondary stat. If you do want to use a gunner piece with this build to further increase your weapon damage, ensure it has melee as its tertiary stat so as to keep your melee stat as high as possible. For armor set bonuses to use with this build, I recommend either the 2-piece Bushido set for its increase to your survivability thanks to its healing, the 4-piece Collective Psyche set for its increase to your Radiant and Restoration buff durations, or the 2-piece Last Discipline set for its increase to your primary ammo weapon reload speed after getting a kill with a primary ammo weapon. With the armor's stats and sets now detailed, I'll get into the armor's mod setup for this build, starting with the helmets mods. First, for helmet mods, the Hands-On mod will grant you an increased amount of super energy when getting kills with your powered melee ability. Hands-On is brought to passively increase your Hammer of Souls uptime, especially given that most of your kills with this build will be with the Throwing Hammer melee. Unfortunately, I'm not actually sure whether Hands-On is more effective than a Super Font mod would be at any specific amount of points in the super stat, so I run Hands-On as it sounds cooler to say than Super Font. Next, the Harmonic Siphon mod will cause an Orb of Power to be summoned upon getting 2 rapid solar weapon kills. Harmonic Siphon is chosen simply to generate Orbs of Power, the collection of which will grant you health via the health stat and the Recuperation Legs mod, along with super energy and stacks of armor charge. Lastly, the Heavy Ammo Finder mod will increase the effect of all contributions towards your heavy ammo meter. Heavy Ammo Finder is simply used to passively increase your heavy weapon's uptime. You won't be using the heavy weapon on its own all too often, but when you do need to use it, having as much ammo for it as you can is always incredibly helpful. Onto your arms mods, firstly, the Heavy-Handed mod on its own will generate an Orb of Power upon getting any powered melee kill, with a 10-second cooldown between orb generations. Heavy-Handed is brought to generate Orbs of Power via kills with your Throwing Hammer melee. By only using one Heavy-Handed mod, you will have a 10-second cooldown between orb generations. However, with a Time Dilation mod or 2 on your mark, plus the Harmonic Siphon mod also generating orbs, one Heavy-Handed mod is more than enough to keep armor charge active consistently. Next, the Melee Font mod by itself will grant you a 20-point increase to your melee stat while you have any stacks of armor charge. Melee Font is chosen to increase your melee stat, and by extension your melee's damage. My melee stat is at exactly 180 points, so I only need one Melee Font mod in order to increase its maximum to 200 points. If you have less than 180 points, running 2 Melee Font mods will increase your melee stat by 40 points while you have armor charge active, which can be the difference between hitting 200 melee and not. Onto your chest pieces mods, simply running whatever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running will suffice. For general content, I usually just run one Arc, one Solar, and one Void resistance mod, but I will change my resistance mods accordingly when I've activated a threat modifier or when I'm playing on a higher difficulty. It's smart to think of what enemy type you'll be fighting against, as they generally have 1 or 2 main sources of damage, so you can tailor your resistance mods against the enemies in the activity you'll be playing. An example is the Vex. Vex have significant void damage sources such as the Laser Harpies, Major Goblins, Minotaurs, Wyverns, Cyclopses, and Hydras. As that's the case, when going into an activity wherein you'll be fighting Vex, bring 2 void resistances and one of a separate damage type. The Vex also have lots of solar damage, with normal harpies, normal goblins, and hobgoblin snipers all dealing solar damage, so I'll use a solar resistance as my 3rd resistance mod. Onto your legs mods, firstly, the recuperation mod will grant you 15 health instantly upon the collection of any orb of power with no cooldown. Recuperation will stack additively with your health stats granted healing when you collect an orb, so recuperation is always a nice boost to your overall active healing ability when collecting orbs of power. Next, the 2 solar weapon surge mods together will grant your solar weapons a 17% boost to their damage while you have any stacks of armor charge. This is a 70% increase in damage over just having 1 solar weapon surge mod equipped. The solar surges will be noticeably helpful for your Devil's Ruin to kill enemies efficiently, especially when combined with the Elemental Overdrive artifact mod and the weapons stat. You'll have armor charge active incredibly often, as most builds will need it in order to hit 200 points in the melee stat, so the solar surges simply use that need to benefit your solar weapons as well. Onto your marks mods, firstly, the Bomber mod will grant you grenade energy every time you use your class ability. Bomber is brought simply because it's a 1 energy cost mod, and none of the other 1 energy mods are as beneficial. Do not use Bomber actively. It's never a good idea to waste the cover of a towering barricade to get a tiny bit of grenade energy. Bomber is just used as a passive amount of grenade energy if you ever happen to cast your barricade while your healing grenade isn't charged. Lastly, for armor mods, the 2 time dilation mods together will cause each stack of decaying armor charge you have to last 80% longer, increasing their duration to 18 seconds from their base of 10 seconds. The time dilation mods are incredibly helpful for this build, as they'll effectively ensure your throwing hammer can keep your armor charge active on its own with only 1 heavy-handed mod equipped. Of course, you'll be supplementing your orb generation with solar weapon kills as well, but time dilation is simply a fantastic piece of utility to ensure you never need to use your weapons to keep your armor charge active. With the armor setup now entirely detailed, I'll get into my recommendations for weapons to use with this build. I'll first go over the kinetic, energy, and heavy slots in order, detailing what weapons I use in those slots specifically, as well as any alternative weapon options there may be. My alternative options won't always be new gear weapons, but they're still plenty usable in all content without the avant-garde modifier active. In the kinetic slot, I use the Wastelander M5 kinetic shotgun from Dares of Eternity with the perk combination of slide shot and 1-2 punch. Wastelander is a fantastic weapon for use in the kinetic slot, but the most important perk to have is 1-2 punch. 1-2 punch will grant all melee abilities a 150% increase to their damage after hitting an enemy with all 12 pellets. 1-2 punch is fantastic for getting the most out of your throwing hammer, especially on higher difficulties, and can mean the difference between killing an enemy with 1 throw or requiring 2 to 3 throws of your hammer. If you're playing activities with a small power delta or no power delta at all, you don't really need 1-2 punch, and a lot of the time I'll use Mint Retrograde just to clear certain activities with ranged enemies I need to kill more quickly. There really aren't many kinetic slot alternative weapons. The only other currently acquirable 1-2 punch kinetic slot shotgun is Swordbreaker from Crota's End, which is a great gun, but not everyone can do raids. As I mentioned, Mint Retrograde is a great weapon for having more range on your special weapon, and the new Ribbontail Strand Trace Rifle from Arms Week is also fine to use, but I don't know if it'll even be acquirable after Arms Week is over. As that's the case, basically use Wastelander for 1-2 punch, and use Mint Retrograde for any activities with the avant-garde modifier. In the energy slot, I use the Devil's Ruin Exotic Solar Sidearm. Devil's Ruin is fantastic, as it'll generate a fire sprite every time you get a kill with the weapon, outside of the fire sprite's innate 5-second cooldown. Furthermore, after collecting a fire sprite, you can load Devil's Ruin with a laser that will cause an ignition on any enemy the laser doesn't outright kill. It's the fire sprite generation that really makes Devil's Ruin fantastic for this build, as it doesn't require anything specific besides just getting one individual kill, but you can use other legendary weapons in its place. Legendary alternatives include the Agape Solar Hand Cannon from the Kepler Destination, the Ahab Char Solar Auto Rifle from the Kepler Destination, the BXR-55 Battler Solar Pulse Rifle from Dares of Eternity, the Phonutria Farah Solar Spreadshot Hand Cannon from the Arms Week event, the Pre-Astyanax 4 Solar Bow from Pinnacle Ops, and the Stars in Shadow Solar Pulse Rifle from Crucible Ops. In the heavy slot, I use the Outrageous Fortune Solar Grenade Launcher from Pinnacle Ops with the perk combination of Stats for All and Explosive Light. My Outrageous Fortune roll is pretty awful, and I definitely recommend the combination of Envious Arsenal and Bait and Switch. Explosive Light is decent in the 4th column, but Bait and Switch will work for your entire reserves, whereas Explosive Light only works for 6 or 7 total shots, depending on whether the perk is enhanced or not. That makes Bait and Switch a much better damage perk, so try to focus that if you can. As far as alternative solar heavy weapons, there are the Apex Predator Solar Rocket Launcher from the Last Wish raid, the Ascendancy Solar Rocket Launcher purchasable from the Monument to Lost Lights in the Tower, the Briar's Contempt Solar Linear Fusion Rifle from the Root of Nightmares raid, the Cataclysmic Solar Linear Fusion Rifle from the Vow of the Disciple raid, the Hezen Vengeance Solar Rocket Launcher from the Vault of Glass raid, and the Marcelian Sea Solar Grenade Launcher focusable at Banshee 44 in the Tower on a daily rotation. With the entirety of the build now detailed, I'll get into a quick description of the playstyle I use when playing with this build to help you get started with using it. The first thing you want to do is generate a fire sprite, whether that's with Devil's Ruin or by defeating a scorched target thanks to Ember of Searing. Once you've collected that fire sprite, you'll be able to start using Melas Panoplia, which is what the entire playstyle really centers around. While you're a Forge Master with Melas Panoplia, you'll be able to recall your throwing hammer, and so long as you've hit an enemy with your throwing hammer, you'll be able to perform a perfect recall. Perfect recalls are actually quite forgiving. Around a second or two after your hammer impacts an enemy, the hammer itself will brightly glow and a sound cue will play. Once you see the glow or you hear the sound cue, you can use your powered melee button to perform a perfect recall, which will cause your hammer to explode at its current location, dealing damage to enemies nearby the explosion. It's the perfect recalls that will keep your Forge Master buff active, as every perfect recall increases Forge Master's timer by 3 seconds. It can take a bit to get used to the rhythm of the perfect recall, but once you do, it's an incredibly fun and flowy style of play. As far as survivability goes, collect fire sprites and walk into sunspots for restoration, collect orbs of power for instant health, recall your throwing hammer after it's impacted an enemy to be cured, and use your healing grenade if you absolutely need to. Lastly, for damage phases, simply use everything you have. On lower difficulties, you can really just use the Forge Master throwing hammer on its own, especially with 3 stacks of the Roaring Flames buff. But on higher difficulties, use your super first, as that'll benefit from the Roaring Flames buff as well. Once you've done that, use your special and heavy ammo as you see fit, and maybe kill adds if there are any with your Forge Master hammer to keep yourself alive if you're taking a lot of damage. But that's pretty much it for this build. Thank you for watching. If this video was helpful to you, or if you learned something, leaving a like or subscribing is very helpful to me and my channel, and I'd appreciate it. If you have any questions, comments, or constructive criticisms, please leave them in the comments section. I read all of them and reply to all that I can. Lastly, if you'd like to join our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs, or simply play some Destiny with us, you can learn more about that by joining our Discord server. The link is in the description. Again, thank you for watching and have a great day.